Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. Atheists are wrong about slavery in the Bible. Is God a moral monster? Did God condone slavery in the Bible? According to new atheist Sam Harris, in an interview with Ben Shapiro on the Daily Wire, God expected and explicitly endorsed slavery in the Old Testament. According to atheist YouTuber Matt Dillahunty, in multiple YouTube videos, God advocates slavery in the Bible. According to Josh Bowen, atheist YouTuber and Assyriologist, God condoned slavery. He and his friend and fellow atheist Skylar Fiction have made numerous videos decrying slavery in the Old Testament, claiming that the God of the Old Testament is immoral. Interestingly, the latter are moral relativists, so they have no objective standards of morality against which to judge history. Josh Bowen has further stated that the two types of slavery in the Old Testament are chattel slavery and debt slavery. Chattel slavery is equivalent to that in the United States history, where slaves were kidnapped, beaten, and bought and sold like property. Debt slavery refers to people who sell themselves and their services to their debtors to pay off their debts in a contractual agreement. This form is often voluntary. I agree that debt slavery was present in the Old Testament, yet chattel slavery was not. The Bible makes explicit many times that all humans are made in God's image in Genesis 1:27, and therefore are intrinsically of value as people, not property. The differences between chattel slavery during the Antebellum period and debt slavery in the Old Testament are significant. For this reason, in 1807, the first version of an abridged Bible was printed, parts of the Holy Bible, selected for the use of the Negro slaves in the British West India Islands. About 90% of the Old Testament had been removed, and about 50% of the New Testament had been removed, according to Anthony Schmidt, the Associate Curator of Bible and Religion in America at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. These passages were removed because they could have prompted rebellion. An example of a passage that was removed is as follows from Galatians 3:28, according to Schmidt. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Retained passages include Ephesians 6:5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Fortunately, Christians were at the forefront of the abolition of slavery in the United States in the 1800s. Today, few, if any, Christians would consider antebellum slavery to be morally correct. Slavery violates our objective moral standards of life, liberty, justice, equality, and love. Pastor Mike Winger has outlined some good responses to atheists who make these comparisons. These are as follows. Unlike antebellum slavery, which was perpetuated by involuntary kidnappings of Africans in Africa, kidnapping was explicitly outlawed in the Old Testament, punishable by death, according to Exodus 21:16. People who seriously injured their slaves had to set them free as compensation in Exodus 21:26. People who intentionally killed their slaves were punished by death, Exodus 21:12 and 21:20. Slaves were given the same human rights as others in Exodus 21. All humans are God's image bearers, Genesis 1:26-27. Slaves were to be treated with compassion, Leviticus 19:33-34. When a foreigner resides among you, in your land do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Runaway slaves were to be freed, according to Deuteronomy 23:15. If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you whenever they like, and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. When slaves were freed, they were to be given generous supplies in Deuteronomy 15:14. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Although some claim that the runaway slave in Deuteronomy 23 isn't a foreigner but an Israelite, we have plenty of reason to reject that idea. For one thing, no mention of the word brother or neighbor is used. In addition, according to Leviticus 25, Israelites weren't allowed to enslave fellow Israelites. Also, the foreign fugitive slave could freely choose a place to live in Israel, in your midst, in one of your towns, Deuteronomy 23:16, unlike the rest of the Israelites who had to stay put on the land allotted to clans, compare with Numbers and Joshua. Thus, those who benefited weren't society's elite, but vulnerable, marginalized foreign persons in the midst of a completely different society. And this is according to Paul Copan. God did not advocate, condone, or endorse slavery. In contrast, God tolerated and regulated it. He permitted slaves in the same way Jesus pointed out that God permitted divorce in Moses' time. Jesus noted that the people had hardened hearts. So though God detests divorce and only considers it acceptable in cases of sexual immorality, he permitted it during Moses' time. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery." That's reported in Matthew 19, 3-9. Slavery formed the financial foundation of societies in ancient times all over the globe. Slavery was also often the gentler option of handling those who lost in war. Rather than slaughter the enemies in war, the winning warriors would take their enemies into their homes as servants. Israelite slaves and foreign abeds. Biblical passages distinguish between the treatment of Israelite slaves and foreign abeds, with the former receiving better treatment. The term abed refers to a slave, servant, bondservant, or employee. Yet no matter the status, as an Israelite or not, all were to be treated as persons, not property. Compare this with Exodus 21, 5-6. This treatment was unique within the laws governing people in the ancient Near East. For example, the Code of Hammurabi permitted masters to cut off the ears of slaves. Royal perpetrators of the law were not held accountable. Kidnapping slaves was not punishable by death, and physical abuse to slaves that resulted in death was not considered murder, according to Paul Copan. In contrast, the Old Testament often notes that God held royal perpetrators accountable. 1 Kings 11 and 13, to 2 Chronicles 26, 19, and 2 Chronicles 33, 10-11. Leviticus 19:15 states, "Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly." These were the foundations to our democratic societies today. Leaders in Western societies are held accountable for their actions. According to Paul Copan, an Israelite strapped for shekels, or money, might become an indentured servant to pay off his debt to a boss or employer. Calling him a master is often way too strong a term, just as the term abed, servant or employee, typically shouldn't be translated as slave. John Goldengay comments that there is nothing inherently lowly or undignified about being an abed. Indeed, it is an honorable, dignified term. Even when the terms buy, sell, or acquire are used of servants, employees, they don't mean the person in question is just property. In Exodus 21:32, the price for an abed was set at 30 shekels, which is the same amount the Pharisees paid Judas to betray Jesus. This price was considered a handsome price in Zechariah 11:13, which portended this transaction with Jesus hundreds of years prior to it. This value further indicated that the services of the abeds were valued highly. They were to be treated as family, not property. Exodus 21, 7-8 underscores this point. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for a son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Men and women were treated differently in the Old Testament based on the different levels of services they could provide. Men were stronger and more likely to do hard labor, while women remained in the homes, nurturing and caring for any children. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee, and I'm quoting this from Leviticus. Then their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Leviticus 25:39-43. Furthermore, to address Sam Harris's assertion that God expected slavery and highlights of the presence of slavery in the Old and New Testament, consider the words of St. Paul, which note we're all slaves to sin in Romans 6:20-22. It says, "For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. Therefore, what benefit were you then deriving from the things of which you are now ashamed? For the outcome of those things is death. But now having been freed from sin and enslaved to God, you derive your benefit, resulting in sanctification and the outcome eternal life." Finally, consider Paul's inclusion of slave traders with lawbreakers and murderers in 1 Timothy 8-11. We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which he entrusted to me. Taken together and in the context of life on this planet, we can interpret these messages to mean that we're all nested within a dominance hierarchy, and at the top of the hierarchy sits God. We are to respect order and reject chaos in our lives, seeking alignment with the creator of order. We are also all to respect those above us in our earthly hierarchical system, paying our taxes and maintaining order within our communities. Respecting and obeying order enhances human flourishing. Paul Copan says, though Israel's laws on servitude weren't the moral ideal, they show far greater moral sensitivity than other ancient Near Eastern texts, such as the Code of Hammurabi, which emphasizes class distinctions and legislation related to slaves, free persons, priests, government officials, and others. Contrary to what Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris say, servanthood in Israel can hardly be called a warrant for trafficking in humans or a means of treating people like farm equipment. No, God's ultimate intention wasn't for humans to keep slaves. In fact, the Genesis ideal is that all humans are equal and that they do not work for another. Rather, each person under God's care is to be his own master, sitting under his own vine and fig tree. And you can compare that with 1 Kings 4:25, Micah 4:4, and Zechariah 3:10. And that's a quote taken from Paul Copan in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? So I hope we've settled some of this debate on slavery in the Bible. It's a tool that many use to try to downgrade and downplay the importance of the Bible and of God. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you'll choose to like and subscribe and come again. Bye-bye.